before that. Om Sthavakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmaswarupini avatara varisthaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha Sudhismritipurananam alayam karunalayam namami bhagavatpadam Shankaram lokashankaram. The next 35th verse, that is a brief description of an ideal spiritual teacher in ancient India. In fact, this very much agrees with the description of a teacher in the Buddhist tradition, mostly in the Abhidhamma Pitaka, Vinaya Pitaka. You find in Buddhist tradition, the Pali canon, there are descriptions of an ideal teacher, a bhikkhu, who is supposed to teach Buddha's teachings. So more or less it agrees with the ancient Vedic tradition. Who should be a teacher? Again, here education is taken as a pilgrimage. It is not just a process of learning or teaching, it is a pilgrimage. So the attitude of an ideal student is like that of a pilgrim going in search of some higher ideas, going to a holy place as a spiritual discipline. So you find 35th one, Srotrayo avrajino akamakato yo brahmavittamaha brahmani uparada shanto nirindhana iva nalaha ahetuga daya sindhuhu bindhuhu anamadam satam. So, who is this teacher? He should be Anamadam Sadam Bindhu, means he is a friend, a guide, a friend and guide of any spiritual seeker who is seeking spiritual enlightenment. And there are a few qualifications given here. First of all, he should be well versed in the scriptures. So Srotriya means Sudartha Sampanna Sampradaya, means somebody who has studied the traditional wisdom as a part of a lineage. Now this is a very, very important thing. I know that in modern times this very idea can be questioned. Why should you study from a traditional teacher? Why can't you learn from whatever sources are available? You can just read a book. Why you can learn from a YouTube in modern times by reading an article? Now here interesting thing is, spiritual practices, spiritual ideals should be learned from a teacher who has studied from his teacher and who is part of a lineage. Now, I can give a simple example in modern times. If you go to, let's say, gymnasium, and if you want to learn weightlifting, you have to learn from a person who has studied that art from a teacher. Some kind of a formal, traditional learning is a prerequisite for any kind of education. Now, one classical illustration can be found in modern times, especially those who learn yoga asanas. A large number of people who initially started learning pranayama during the early decades of 20th century, especially when Swami Shivananda, the founder of Divine Love Society in Rishikesh, he was the first prominent teacher who is responsible for the popularization of yogasana, yoga postures. And as part of the yoga training, pranayama and breathing exercises were also taught. Now, during the early days, when people started learning with great enthusiasm these breathing exercises, they naturally had to, they faced lots of problems. Especially, it is a well-known fact that anyone who practices breathing exercises without discipline and without a teacher who guides him, is likely to face many, many serious problems. We can become quite fatal. For example, delusions are very common among those who practice pranayama for a long time, who overdo this. And there is a tendency for overdoing, because when you do pranayama, according to some instructions that you may read from a book or maybe YouTube, and you may feel a lot of enthusiasm because it generates energy and heat. And when you feel energized, when you feel a lot of enthusiasm, you have a tendency to do it and eventually to overdo it. And that can lead to psychological problems. Mostly delusions. Delusions of grandeur are very common. I mean, you may suddenly feel you are elevated, you have some mission for this life. This is the very common thing. And unfortunately, the regular psychiatric treatment won't help to get out of this unless you stop doing this. Now, the instruction that one should not overdo this, or should do it only under certain conditions, following certain disciplines. Food, discipline with regard to what you eat, how you behave, and all these things are important because it has something to do with the state of mind. So when mind is over-energized, it naturally can lead to these bipolar problems. You feel extremely energized and you also feel depressed. Now, so that shows the importance of sampradaya. Sampradaya means lineage. So one of the definitions of Srotriya, the literal meaning is somebody Srudartha Sravana Sampradaya. The literal meaning is somebody who studied the Vedas. Here Vedas means spiritual literature. And that can include Yoga Sutra also in the broader sense, from a teacher. So a teacher who has studied from his teacher, because he not only carries with him the intellectual knowledge, the information part of what he learns, but also the way to manage to properly make proper use of what you have learned, and to avoid making improper use of it. So how to learn and how to manage your learning. So all these skills are included in education. That's why one should learn from a teacher. Now, if you want to handle a machine, you can learn from YouTube. But if you learn meditation or pranayama from YouTube, that means the pharmaceutical lobbies making psychiatric medicine, they the only people who are going to be benefited by that. That's an important point to remember. That's why Srotriya. This in a broader sense is true also in secular education, where engineering, medicine, anything. You always, if you go for a doctor, then you will like to know his background, whether he has a medical degree or not. So you have to make sure that he has been to a medical institution, a college, university, where he has sat under the feet of, literally, who is, in a metaphor, who has studied from another doctor. Or if you want to construct a house, you look for an architect or an engineer who has been to an education institution where he starts engineering, how to build a home. So there is that intimate connection with lineage, it is called. So that's an important point of this Srotriya. Literal meaning is somebody who studied the Vedas. But it involves, so great commentators will tell you, Sudartha Sampannaha, Sampradaya. They use these terms to make clear the implication of this word. Somebody who studied the Vedas, to study from a teacher who has studied from his teacher. And so they actually transmit this knowledge. And along with learning, they also transmit and they give the next generation a kind of common sense, which is difficult to define, which is needed for us to know, to make proper use of what we learned. Avrajinaha. So again, a person who is living a moral life, ethical life, who is not indulging in sinful deeds. Akamakataha, again, those who don't have any desire, no selfish desire. Then, your Brahmavittamaha, he should be a knower of Brahman. Brahmani uparadasyantu nirindhana iva analaha. So, those who are immersed, or those who are contemplative on Brahman, the ultimate spiritual truth, a little bit of contemplative nature is also important for a teacher. So, maybe in learning other branches, other disciplines, you may have a lot of enthusiasm, You find in modern advertisements a well-fed, heavily built, strong person sits wearing a t-shirt with a shaven head, very enthusiastically, marketing his great knowledge of Aristotle in 20 minutes. That's perfectly okay for modern learning, how to handle a machine, how maybe whether something that you buy from the market is proper or not. For higher learning, you need a teacher who is not over enthusiastic about marketing his cheap products, who is a bit withdrawer. You may call it spiritual aristocracy, so to speak. That somebody who is so learned but not overly enthusiastic about marketing his learning. So these are all very, very important things. That's a sign of wisdom. Wisdom and what we call higher wisdom. So here you find a word is used, nirindhana iva analaha. Anala means fire. So for fire, but all the fuel completely exhausted. Suppose you are starting a fire, but all the twigs, dry twigs that you may feed the fire with to keep it alive, the whole thing completely burned and it become ashes. The fire cannot continue burning. Like that, all desires, all aspirations, lower aspirations, so to speak, have completely ceased. No more, because it is the lower aspirations or worldly desires that keep our emotions alive, like dry twigs or fuel keeps flame alive. You remove all the dry twigs and fuel from that flame, then the fire is gone. Suppose a man has no desire, no selfish desire, no worldly aspirations, they all become practically inactive, like twigs, dry twigs become completely burned, so you cannot feed the flame. The flame is gone. Like that, somebody whose low desires, lowly aspirations have completely ceased to exist. That's an important characteristic of a true teacher. So a teacher with a selfish aspiration can never be a true teacher in any tradition. Of course, in the higher sense, you find there are examples of great teachers, even in empirical sciences. But this is especially true for spiritual learning. That's why learning or education itself becomes a higher pursuit in search of some higher transcendental goal in life. That's why it's a pilgrimage. It is not a transaction. It's not something that we pay and learn and buy from the market. That's rotriyaha avrujinaha. You should be somebody who studied the scriptures as part of a lineage of teachers, and then who is free from any sinful aspirations, is totally free from selfish desires, and is immersed who has got a withdrawing attitude towards worldly things. And again, there are no selfish aspirations left. And then, ahetuka daya sindhuhu bindhuhu anamadam sadam. So you find some of the words used at least, it's like a poetry. It's a great, beautiful poetry. So, ahetuka daya, daya means compassion. Compassion without any selfish desire, any motive, without any strings attached. It's an ocean of this compassion. So again, Anamadam Sadam Bindhu means is a friend, a guide, a philosopher of those who are humble and polite, those who are spiritually oriented, those who are spiritual pilgrims. He is a friend. Now, one important aspect of this kind of spiritual education is you start looking upon spiritual education or education in general as a pilgrimage. Otherwise, education can cause a lot of, what do you call this brain rot. You can see any normal religious books. They ask us to think in a certain manner, to see things in a specific manner, and to conceive of an anthropomorphic God idea who is very arbitrary in his decision making and who only wants you to pay allegiance to him. That's the idea of a monotheistic Godhead in popular anthropomorphic religious traditions. But here, Shankaracharya is not talking about any specific God or any specific religious ideal. What he is talking about is the universal spiritual aspirations of human beings, how they should seek an answer to their spiritual questions. It's very easy to surrender spiritual freedom. Oh God, you do everything on my behalf. And then we can have some kind of any understanding with our own idea of God and do whatever we want. We can be totally inhuman and monstrous in our dealings with other fellow human beings because we are in the good books of our own God. So that's not talking about. There is no scope for any kind of unethical idea, unethical behavior, action. We should become broad-minded, compassionate, spiritual human beings. And this is a common discipline for all spiritual seekers. So it's a very, very well-known verse which actually explains a lot about who should be a teacher. One may not get such a teacher in modern times. That's true, not always. But still we can keep in our mind what should be the qualities of an ideal teacher. At least it will help us to become ideal students. So that is an important practical benefit. It's a very well-known verse which frequently quoted. Next verse is this continues. So I normally in serious philosophical exposition of this book, some of these verses are frequently left out. These are details, especially when we teach in higher education institutions, because these are all very well understood. But still, it has got a great cultural value, social value. What education ought to be, how we can bring in some kind of spiritual ideal into this entire process of education, even in modern times. Tam aradhya gurum bhaktya prashraya sevanaihi prasannam tam anuprapya pruchet jnatavyam. So this verse gives certain qualities on the part of an ideal student. So the student, what should be the state of his mind? What should be his attitude? Now, one important point in spiritual life is we get only according to what our mind is ready for. So, Sri Ramakrishna says, one important thing, so the knowledge of Brahman, spiritual knowledge is like an ocean, or maybe, let's say, a huge hill of, let's say, sugar grains. So a little ant goes to this huge mountain of sugar, and you find maybe billions and trillions of sugar grains, the huge mountain. So the little ant, it goes and then it picks up just one grain, and its mouth is full. It cannot eat anymore, and it returns. You see, next time, tomorrow when I go, I shall bring a bag. I shall take the entire mountain of sugar with me. So that's what the ant thinks. The next day again, he can, at the most, can only take one grain. So he can only as much as he is ready for it. So if we go to an ocean with a small glass in our hands, we can only carry a glass full of water. Depends upon the size of the vessel that we have. Like that, we can learn spiritual ideas from any teacher only as much as our mind is ready and fit for. But in modern times, the problem is, this is completely forgotten, and then you are given this wrong notion, this delusion, that you can immediately become a Buddha, because that is very helpful. That helps you in marketing your views. Nobody will have the patience to behave like this student we are talking about here. Maybe it's not possible in modern times, but the idea of the humility, the politeness, the mental discipline that's required for higher spiritual learning, and also the fact that these qualities enabled a Buddha to become a Buddha. One may argue that Buddha did not approach teacher. It's totally wrong. Buddha did have teachers. Buddha walked from Lumbini to Bodh Gaya, and then before sitting there, he already had association with many. He had discussions, and he learned a lot from different teachers, including the teachers of Vardhamana Mahavira, who was the founder of Jaina religion. So Vardhamana Mahavira was an elder contemporary of Buddha. He was a prince of a small kingdom in Vaishali, in today's central provinces in India. Buddha was a prince of Lumbini in Nepal. So this Mahavira, who was the founder of Jaina religion, you may have heard of this extreme non-violent people, Those, they close their mouth, their nose, because they should not breathe in some bacteria. So they won't move anywhere, but they cannot trample over an ant or an insect. So kind of non-violent extremists, so to speak. They practice so much of non-violence that they impose on themselves great austerity. So some of Buddha's teachers were these followers of Vardhamana Mahavira. And also he learned from many teachers, Gita, Upanishad, Vedas, all those things he learned. So he did have teachers. But then he wanted something different. So he went to meditate, and he found out this middle path, which is not totally different from Vedanta, but it was a different approach from Vedanta, a different approach, a humanistic approach. So, but then he also had these qualities. So the Buddhist tradition in the Abhidhamma and in the Pali canonical literature, the three Vedakas called Sutta Vedaka, Vinaya and Abhidhamma. These two books contain a lot of important disciplines for Buddhist bhikshus, learnings. There also you find, so one quality is called Trikarana Suddhi. Purity means one should be pure mentally, physically, verbally. Means one should, by word, one should be pure, practicing non-violence, truthfulness. Mentally also, thoughts should be pure. And also activities, actions should be pure. It's called Trikarana Shuddhi. So that's mentioned here. Tamaradhi Gurum Bhaktya Prakhva Prasraya Sevanaihi. That means humility, politeness, and service. And Prasannam Tam Anuprapya Prachet Jnadavyam Atmanaha. So when these qualities are found in any teacher, that's enough. That's enough tuition fees that you're giving to the teacher. You don't give money, but you give fees. The payment is in terms of our own spiritual qualities. So a true, genuine spiritual seeker, for him, there is no better qualification than these qualities: politeness, humility, etc. This again is very much true in modern secular education also. Unless you have a great aspiration to learn something, so your mind becomes ready to learn something new. So you are fully aware that you don't know what you are now going to learn. So an extreme desire to learn and the total conviction that this is something that you don't know right now is a new knowledge. So all this, but they are given a spiritual orientation. Then it becomes a prerequisite for any spiritual student. Prachet Jnadavyam Atmanaha. Then he should talk like this. So the conversation, how a student should begin his conversation also is very significant. Again, these great ideas from an ancient book, we all know very well that in modern secular education, this is certainly not practical. But the main lesson we have to learn is the idea of politeness, humility, a sense of respect and reverence for the subject we are learning, and also the teacher from who we are learning, and also to the institution, the society from where we learn all this. This sense of politeness and the spiritual attitude can have a refining effect on the mindset of students. If students are qualified, into many big organizations are paying huge fees, huge donations to many universities. In Stanford University, if you read many of the great American universities, the early European universities were all mostly funded by the Catholic Church in France and other countries. Secular education, in Oxford, Sorbonne, all the universities do have a background where great spiritual or religious teachers were behind the founding of these universities. Especially in Europe, even American universities were great industrialists, philanthropists who were responsible for the founding of these universities, which attract students from around the world who are given a lot of facilities, including scholarship. Now, in a way, if students approach these universities with a sense of reverence and respect, it's not that you surrender yourself, that you have no freedom of speech, that you should be slavish. Not at all. People frequently interpret respect and reverence as a sign of slavishness. But remember, if you are not respectful to a higher ideal, you will be slaves of a diabolic ideology. There is no escape from that. The only way for us to escape the influence of a diabolic, monstrous, sometimes violent ideology is to be respectful towards a higher spiritual ideology. If you don't have something higher, if you have a higher ideal to guide us, we will be enslaved by a lower ideal. So, that's why, here, Tamaradhi Gurum Bhaktya Prasya Sevanaihi. So, politeness, humility, a sense of respect and reverence for teachers, subject, teaching, the institution that is imparting the education. All these are very, very important. And then the student should ask these questions. The 37th verse is a very interesting, it's an ancient idea. So you have to remember in those days, students, young students from villages, sometimes kings and emperors and monarchs giving up their thrones. They also went to forest hermitages for spiritual education. So all people went for this. So there, Swami Namaste Nataloga Binthu Karunya Sindhu Patitam Bhavabdhu Mam Uddhara Atmiya Kataksha Drishtiya Rijwadi Karunya Sudabdhi Vrishtiya. So the idea is very simple. So it's called Pariprashna, means how to approach a spiritual teacher. So there are a few, again you have to remember it's a grand example of Shankaracharya's amazing, absolutely incomparable poetical genius. You'll be surprised, according to many Indian literary critics, if Shankaracharya had not written these great philosophical, classical commentaries on the Gita or the Upanishads and Brahma Sutras, and also innumerable introductory works on Vedanta, and he had not traveled around the Indian subcontinent 4 times, arguing, and then if he had not reinstalled hundreds of temples and not founded 10 monastic orders, he's the greatest system builder in the history of monastic traditions. If he had not done all this, and if he had just written some of these poetical classics, he would have been ranked as a far greater poet than Kalidasa. Kalidasa is traditionally considered to be India's greatest Sanskrit poet. But that's only because Shankaracharya, along with writing poetical works which are greater than Kalidasa's works, but he also wrote the great commentaries on philosophy. So he is not known as a poet so much, but is more known as a philosopher. So this is a marvelous poetical genius. So he says, Nataloga Bantho, you are a friend and guide and philosopher of those who turn to you, who are polite and humble towards you, coming to you for spiritual wisdom. Karunya Sindhu Patitam Bhavabdhu. So again, we are all fallen into this ocean of samsara. Samsara is a regular word. Again, it's used in Buddhist tradition also, Samsara is a word. When you practice this eightfold discipline, then you get nirvana, you get liberated from this samsara. Mamuddhara Atmiya Kadaksha Drishtiya. Please save me from this ocean of samsara. What is samsara? Samsara is this terrible, endless cycle or cycles of birth, life, death and rebirth without making an inch of progress in spiritual life. Just being born, enjoying and suffering, again dying, again just being reborn, and this cycle, the drama continues. So we want to escape from this, and that's again is the goal in Buddhism. Rijwadi Karunya Sudabdhi Vrishtiya. So you pour your compassion on all of us like a rain, like a rainfall falling on our heads as a blessing. You pour your compassion on all of us. Again, there's a description of how the student feels about himself. So, Durvara Samsara Devakni Taptam Dhuyamanam Duradushtabadaihi Bhidam Prapannam Paripahi Mrityoho Sharanyamanyam Pidaham Najane. So, Mrityoho Paripahi, which means save us from death. That's the request. How do we get saved? How does someone save us from death? Here, death means the spiritual retardation, stagnation, that is being part of this endless wheel of samsara, birth, death and rebirth. from this, there is no end to this. We want to escape from this. So we are all being burned in this fire of samsara, fire of this suffering, so again continuous suffering from life to life. You should escape. You should save us from this. Now, again, the student gives a very interesting understanding of who is an ideal teacher. This is also another very well-known verse. Shanta Mahanto Nivasanti Sandhu Vasandavat Lokahidam Charantaha Tirna Suyam Bhima Bhavarnavam Janan Aheduna Anyabi Tarayanta. So who are these spiritual teachers? Yeah, of course we are talking about great teachers like Buddha and others, epoch makers. First of all, the Shanta, they are calm and quiet and self-restrained. Then Mahanto, they are all knowers of Brahman. Then they are living in this world. How do they live in this world? Just like, this, like a spring season. The season of spring brings joy and happiness, sustenance, beauty and charm in nature and also in a human mind. So all great teachers are, they're calm and quiet and they're self-restrained, and also they are like spring seasons. And they go about traveling from place to place. The ancient sages in India used to move from place to place. So many of our great books are nothing but dialogues between these wandering monks. They were not always monks. They were also a group of people who are no longer active householders. They have left their homes because they have already become middle-aged. They already have done their duties and responsibilities, obligations to their wife, children and parents. So they want to spend the rest of their lifetime for meditation, contemplation. Such people are also with the great saints, philosopher saints, like Yajnavalkya and others you find in the tradition you find. They used to go from place to place. They used to visit emperors in their courts, the kings in their courts. They used to engage in debates on spiritual topics. They used to impart teaching from the Vedas to oral tradition. So that's why they go from place to place. They are a blessing for humanity. They are a blessing for human civilization. Tirna Swayam Bhima Bhavarnavam Janan. Again, they themselves have escaped from this world of samsara. Now they want to save other people from this samsara. So with this purpose, they go like this. Now, in the 45th verse, you can find the teacher is addressing the student. Now, that is the 45th verse. When the student, this continues for a few verses like this. The student talks about the importance of going to teacher and who are the great teachers, what's their role. Now, in the 45th verse, it's called Margopadesha, means this first one is Guru Pasati, means going to teacher. The teacher is replying. Ma bhaishta vidvanstava nastipaya samsara sindhos tarani asti upaya yenaiva yatra yatayosyaparam tameva margam tava nirdishyami. So teacher tells the student, don't worry, don't think about it. Now remember, the text is exclusively in the context of a spiritual instruction. So this is an important point to remember. So again, the student feels that the world is a terrible place. Now this is not the feeling of a normal person. Many people do feel this at different times. When things don't really work according to our expectations, we frequently feel The world is certainly not a very wonderful place to live in. But then at that time we may rush to a library, read a Bible, Sermon on the Mount. May next week I will go to the church, or may go to Vedanta Society, I will meditate. At that time we feel a great impulse, and we decide to look for something higher in life. But then when things come back to normal situations, that aspiration is gone. So if we can continue that aspiration, then what we can do, along with our normal worldly obligations, secular, office job or other activities, we can create a small little shrine in our own heart. That means we can give little place, small little limited space for spiritual aspirations also. Because whenever people feel this inner despair, the need for something higher, you are creating an outlet, a channel, which will help us to live in this world with less conflicts, and maybe it will help us to face many of the problems in secular world. That's why interest in spiritual life has one very practical benefit from a very raw utilitarian standpoint. That is, if you are interested in higher life, spiritual life, that interest itself will help us to look at this world and our own world of secular obligations in a more intelligent manner. When things don't work according to our expectations, we can, there is something much higher than this. This is the only thing in this world. There is something higher. So that feeling that there is something higher to pursue, to go after, that conviction itself will help us and will save us a lot of problems. Suppose we feed this world and all that we experience in our everyday life, it is the only thing that really matters, nothing else, then a small little problem can become a great disaster. It becomes a great dilemma. On the other hand, when we also remember there are higher things in this world than worldly pursuits, that conviction there are higher things to look for, to aspire for, that itself will have a healing effect on our own mind. So that's why the teacher says, Ma bhaishta. The first means ma bhaishta means don't be afraid, don't be scared. Scared means the student feels there is a big medical bill coming, I've lost my job, something absolutely terrible is happening. Not only this, it could also be that the richest man in the world also can feel the same fear of worldly pursuit. He can also feel this emptiness and what you call this fear. The word fear, need not take it in the literal sense. The sense of despair when some people feel, well, everything is wonderful, but is there something else that I should look for, I should seek? Is this world of world enjoyment, that's the only thing there is, or is there something higher? Now, that thought comes to a person. In Yoga Sutra, it is called Parinama Dukkha. In the Sadhana Pada, in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, Parinama Tapa Samskara Dukkhaihi Guna Visheshaja Dukkhameva Sarvam Vivekinaha. So, Dukkhameva Sarvam Vivekinaha, that is the end, the last part of the sutra. Parinama Tapa Samskara Dukkhaihi. Now, this Parinama Dukkha is the what is Parinama Dukkha? One of the commentators, in fact, he is the primary commentator, Vyasa says, Parinama Dukkha is a feeling of despair in spite of everything going according to your expectations. Suppose you are a very rich person, well employed, everything wonderful. Still you feel, well, it's so boring every day to live in a palatial home, having a very wonderful job, driving an expensive car with all the friends around, every day caviar. Now, still, that's not enough for human life. Is that enough? Is there something higher? That feeling of total despair, in spite of all worldly things going on well for you. That's why Vyasa says, Yoginam eva Krishnadi. That kind of higher aspirations, looking for something transcendental, in spite of the fact that everything is going on well for you. That feeling of despair comes only to some highly evolved souls. Yoginam eva Krishnadi, Vyasa says. It happens only to those who have practiced some yoga. It requires a higher level of fineness or spiritual refinement to feel that living in a palace with all the wonderful things, where that's not enough. There is something higher I should look for. That's what happened to Buddha. I say with every day this palace or the servants, luxurious life, all the people around him praising him, it's so boring, it is so meaningless, so painful. So he wants to leave the place. So it takes a higher level of refinement, a higher culture to feel disappointed or despair under such luxurious conditions. So this could happen to anyone. Any person it could happen. So that's why the first word that teacher uses is ma bhaishta. Don't be scared. Vidwan. So addresses the student. Tava nasti paya. So there is no worry for you. Don't be frightened. Don't be scared. He is not talking to somebody who is running away from a worldly disaster. He is talking to somebody who feels, like Buddha felt, well, this boring life of luxury and enjoyment, there's no meaning in it. It is terrible. So the teacher tells him, there is no terror, don't worry about it. That's an important point. The fear is, the feeling of fear that comes to a highly evolved person who is so painful about continuing these endless cycles of life, enjoyments and things like that. There is no room for you for any fear. Samsara sindhoho tarane astipayaka. There is a way to get out of the samsara. So you find very often this is, Shankaracharya is writing this book based on the Upanishads, the ancient Vedic teachings. These ancient Vedic teachings took more or less the same tone, the same line of interpretation in Buddha's original teachings, which are found in the Sutta Pitaka. Mostly Sutta Pitaka you find. Mostly you find in the most summarized form you can get in the Dhammapada. It's part of Sutta Pitaka. This idea of how to look for higher aspirations. Yeneva yatra yatayosya param tameva margam tava nidishyami. So many ancient sages in the past have gone across this ocean of samsara, this ocean of worldly bondage. And the same path I am going to teach you now. So there again, but the teacher is Srotriya. I mean, so this is continuity and the antiquity of ancient, continuity and antiquity. It's an ancient path. That is very important. You can see the striking parallel between modern science and Vedanta. If somebody is going to university or even at primary school as a student learning physics, if he tells his teacher, well, I won't care for what Einstein taught, then he will have no place in any school. You have to follow You can go beyond Einstein if you yourself become a great scientist like him. But you cannot begin your education by rejecting Einstein. Because that's again parampara. The same, what you call sampradaya, lineage as we call it. You can find it in all branches of learning. Or classical music, we can see. So you can find the same tradition lineage you find. So the teacher tells him, I'm going to teach you the same ancient path which is followed and which is well established by the great teachers, great saints of ancient times. Same path I'm going to teach you. Now we can have interaction. You're most welcome.
I remember, Swamiji, I remember reading a long time ago that depression is not when you feel sad and everything is going wrong. It's when everything is going right and you feel sad. Is this similar to the fear or despair you were talking about when things are going right and when everything is good?
Yeah, that's in modern time there's a problem. The problems of abundance you find. In some countries where they have state protection for education, pension, retirement, everything wonderful. And then they feel depression. In some countries where the state is taking care of every aspect of your life, everything wonderful, there's a high degree of depression. That's because the absence of any higher aspiration. That actually underlines what we are discussing right now. Because without some kind of a transcendental ideal, you won't be able to get real contentment. People may try to divert their attention to drawing, painting, music, poetry. That's fine. But suppose you become a painter and you don't do very well, or you don't get the recognition that you deserve. In music it happens. Great geniuses who are very great geniuses in art, literature, music, poetry. Many of them remain unknown. Many of them did not get the recognition that they deserved. It's a fact. So when you don't have a spiritual aspiration, and instead of going for a spiritual, higher, transcendental aspiration, you just divert your mind towards something like art, musical, literature, and try to excel in that area. It can give you temporary solution, temporary happiness, no doubt. But again, there also, if you don't get the recognition, again, you don't get that contentment. So, as you mentioned, this despair is very common among those who have no room for any complaint from a worldly perspective. And also, very often you find the same problem among people who do have room for complaint because they don't have a job or money. And actually, the latter problem is somewhat simple, relatively speaking, because when a person feels despair because he doesn't have a good job or enough money or resources, the solution is quite simple. He works hard, gets a good job, and he can solve the problem of poverty or unemployment. So the solution is very simple because the problem is so explicit. But suppose you have everything going on well for you, still you feel this lack of higher, that requires a higher refinement. It's an important thing to remember. So that person will normally look for something higher. So that's what Patanjali talks about, parinama dukkha, transformatory conviction of the impermanence of this world. That's the real meaning of dukkha. So it brings about a transformation in your life. Because when you feel that in spite of everything going on well for you, no problem, still you look for something higher, some higher aspiration. Now the point is, if a spiritual seeker has a higher aspiration, as a solution for his material problems, to give an example, suppose somebody who doesn't have a job, some other difficulties, so becomes a spiritual devotee of God. And if he gets a good job, he may forget everything, he may go back to previous life. But that also is there. So, the higher aspiration, in spite of having no justification for any worry, still you worry about some higher ideas. That requires a higher evolution. That's what Patanjali is talking about. Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah.
Mike was telling me not to ask the question.
No. It asks you to use a better machine. So the question is so very important.
My question is, there are examples in history of lineage being disrupted, sometimes by invasions, wars, other things that are beyond the control of the best intentions of the people who wanted to preserve the lineage. Does history show us that the lineage reestablishes itself despite interruptions, or does history show us that it's calamitous? My guess is that the lineage reestablishes itself because of the power of the spirituality itself. But I'm interested in your answer because I hope that's not just wishful thinking.
No, that's true. You know, if a lineage has a kind of spiritual vitality behind it, as its very core, and not just external power. I can give an example. See, think of the Aztec, Mayan, Incan, or Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, all these cultures. They also had reached a very high level of perfection in architecture. As very obvious, everyone knows. You think of pyramid and things like so. And also even scientific processes, how they learned to preserve the mummies. Even so, there are many wonderful things. But you find the lack of spiritual vitality at its core, which is preserved and transmitted by a lineage of teachers in an unbroken succession. That was why they practically disappeared. Nobody knows how they built the pyramids. Nobody knows, absolutely. Even the architecture marvels of Latin America, South America, many things. They're all still wonderful things, absolutely marvelous. But then, the lack of a lineage which preserves and transmits the vitality to succeeding generations, that must be the cause of the disappearance altogether. I can give an example. If you go to the Bay Area and New Jersey, huge temples, absolutely crazy from one perspective. Why do you billions of dollars constructing temples? But you find that the artisans, the architectural style that they used for building those structures are the same that was used in Angkor Wat, which I visited about 1.5 months ago. the ancient Hindu temple in Cambodia, or the Hindu temples in India that you find this time today. The same architectural style is a continuing of the music, the art. This lineage can also be found in maybe in European countries, in the cathedrals and other you find that. Or in Jewish tradition, but they preserve this teacher-student succession, the sanctity and sacredness that they attach to it. This perhaps have preserved a tradition, a culture which otherwise would have disappeared from the world. So, I think a lineage to be spiritually dynamic requires some exalted human beings, teachers and their students as part of the core element of that lineage. It may not necessarily be in the form of architecture or music. It can be in the form of certain sacred teaching. You feel you have something to hold on to, which is sacred. So you are at this end of the lineage, the link, the 21st century. But there was somebody who was on the other end 5,000 years ago. So it has remained active and alive. That conviction helps a society, a culture to survive. It's the oxygen. Without that oxygen, civilizations will collapse and disappear. Toynbee, arguably the greatest name in modern Western historiography, it's a greatest. So study of history is a classic even now. So he has studied the rise and fall of different civilizations. But he has analyzed as a response to a challenge. So every historical event is a response to a challenge, and that challenge may also can be part of the chain reaction. But when he talks about Indian civilization, he talks about teachers who appear from time to time. Even this book that we are discussing right now, 8th century AD. And if you go to India, you don't think that every Indian is aware of this. Absolutely wrong. They don't know, even they don't care also to know. But if you study this, you feel, there is something sensible about this book. That's because you are a spiritual seeker. That's the only qualification required. So it's the universal appeal. That is also can be part of the secret of the continuity and antiquity. So great teachings, which are the contributions of great teachers, will always revitalize dying cultures and dying civilizations. So you are right, actually, you are right. This lineage which is activated and made dynamic and which is established in antiquity and continuity and modernity. So antiquity is very ancient. It continues to flourish in our own times. And again, because there is an element of modernity, because it can be made modern. It can be made modern. When I teach this Vivekachudamani, which belongs to 8th century AD, we can still talk about the need for students' discipline, the need for a sense of sacredness and sanctity. That should be part of modern education. That can be an answer to many of the problems we are facing in our campuses, and how we are facing many problems in the absence of those values. See, if we don't, as I mentioned earlier, if we don't look for a higher ideal, we have to pay a terrible price. What's the price? We'll be enslaved by a lower ideal. That's it. Because human mind cannot remain stagnant. This is an important thing. If we don't give the right food to our mind would eat toxic poison and will die. So that's why all these great teachings can be a great food, nourishing food for education. We are talking about student and teacher relationship. Absolutely impractical, we can all understand in modern campuses. But the idea that students should be taught to respect the teachers and should attach a sense of sanctity and sacredness and reverence for the subject and also the teacher and the teaching institutions as a whole, that idea has a tremendous practical significance even in the 21st century, in our own time. If you want any proof, you will read the newspapers, you can see. Nothing more. You don't have to look too far. So that's why Shankaracharya's teachings are as modern, as relevant today, if not more, than his own times. Thank you for that very wonderful, important question. Thank
you. Excuse me. Swamiji, a question about spiritual humor. Sri Aurobindo once said, "A God without a smile could have never created such a humorous universe." And I found that after 30 years of going into the mountains and being alone, I find that we really are not alone. So communicating with the ants, the snakes, the mountain lions, the bears, listening to the streams, looking at the flight of birds, it's such a beautiful experience and so enlightening that I would almost call this the universal guru, because all the dynamics within the flow of Mother Nature is life-giving. And there seems to be a certain amount of humor in our relationship to her, because basically the Great Mother wants and loves us to fulfill and to realize her within ourselves.
Yeah, no, that divine humor, God being having a wonderful sense of humor, but that God need not be an anthropomorphic God, because if you talk about a God who creates this world and then all the COVID-19, all these wars, terrible things around, that kind of humor may not be shared. So that idea of God is a higher, let's say, there is an element of internal balancing system in creation. That's all we can talk about. Internal balancing system, you're right. The trees and mountains and valleys and ants, they all together, they all form one compact entity. And in the higher sense, in this text it comes later, the idea that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in Mahabharata, Shankaracharya comes to that towards the end of this text. I mean, the entire creation is one spiritual family. That idea is emphasized again and again towards the end of this text, when he talks about Advaita, many of the metaphysical ideas of Advaita, the spiritual unity and oneness of existence and creation. So I fully share with your idea, God be having a sense of humor, Yeah, that's a very wonderful thing. Yeah.
Do you think it's a question of language? Because in the West, they speak of God. In the East, they speak of divinity.
No, in the East also there are many ideas which are very similar to anthropomorphism. So don't think that the whole East is Vedantic. No, there are all kinds of tribalistic ideas in the East. Absolutely, that's a very wrong idea. In fact, in the Hebraic tradition, the Hellenic tradition, there are many wonderful ideas: universality, beauty, and aesthetic beauty and charm of nature. Everything is there. And also in Eastern religious traditions, there's plenty of tribalism. The idea that you are in good terms with your own God and not in good terms with somebody else who has a different idea of God. That you find in the East also. So we cannot draw a line of demarcation. So one thing about this text is, it is all about the universal spiritual aspirations of human beings, no matter what religion, what tradition he belongs to. Even if you don't believe in God, even if you are not a religious person, you will have higher spiritual aspirations. that you don't find, that you find in this book. So God is not a part of the spiritual philosophy mentioned here. Belief in God and prayer to God is very important, very useful, an integral part of spirituality. But that's not what is emphasized in this book. What this book emphasizes is the universal spiritual aspirations of humanity. That's it. That's the universality of this book.
Do you see any linkage with Jainism? Because they didn't believe in God, but they believed in the jinas.
Yeah. Maybe Bobby Coleman will be able to give his views on this subject.
On the Jains? On the Jains, he says about the
Yeah,
Jains.
please give the phone again once more.
What's the question?
Yeah, the question you raised just now in Jewish tradition?
No, I had studied Jainism extensively.
Jainism, you're talking about Jainism.
Yeah,
Sorry,
because they don't believe in God.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll come to that. Sorry, I didn't hear properly. Thank you. Now, Jainism is agnostic, not atheistic. Jainism doesn't believe doesn't affirm the existence of a God. Jainism essentially believes in austerity, in practicing non-violence, ethical moral values. And that's enough for you to reach what called nirvana, the idea of nirvana in Jainism also. That itself is the ultimate goal of human life. So what you said is true. Jainism is agnostic, not atheistic, agnostic. It doesn't affirm the existence of a God. But at the same time, it doesn't deny it. You find, surprisingly, all the followers belonging to Jaina religion are believers in God. They believe, they practice spiritual disciplines like any believers of Hinduism. Practically, it has merged with Hinduism, Jainism. In Jainism, there is so much emphasis on non-violence, extreme self-denial, an extreme way of looking at some of the ethical moral disciplines which Buddha emphasized as a means for nirvana. Samyak drishti, samyak ajiva, etc. Proper perspective, proper way of life, proper speech, proper concentration, mindfulness, and all these qualities, samyak smriti, samyak samadhi, samyak ajiva, samyak vyayam, all these you find Jainas also accepted. But they didn't talk too much about this higher nirvana, but they also aimed at reaching that goal. That's because Jainism was never completely detached from Hinduism. Buddhism got detached about 60, 70 years after Buddha's passing away. Maybe it didn't take that long, just after the first Buddhist council. But Jainism was never completely separate from Hinduism. It is true, it doesn't have this image worship that Hindus normally have, but you find all the Jains practices Hinduism mostly. Gandhi was a Jain by conviction, but he was also a Hindu. Good example. Many such examples you find. I think we have a wonderful session. Thank you. So we'll continue our class next week. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Pranamastu.